The knock on James Crawford's door came at midnight, in the middle of a thunderstorm that had turned the Texas Hill Country into a river of red mud. And when he opened it, he found a woman standing there with a baby pressed against her chest, and a look in her eyes that said she had already survived the worst night of her life, and was simply waiting to see what came next. She was young, maybe 22 or 23, with dark hair plastered flat against her cheeks from the rain, a dress so thin and worn through that the water had soaked it clear to her skin, and boots that had split along the left sole so that every step she had taken across his property had let the mud squeeze up between her toes. The baby, tiny and wrapped in what appeared to be a man's flannel shirt, was mercifully asleep despite the thunder cracking overhead. The woman's eyes were a deep, steady brown, the kind that had seen too much in too few years, and they met his without apology or the downward cast that most frightened women showed when they came to a stranger's door. "I am sorry to trouble you this late," she said, and her voice was steady even though her whole body was shaking from the cold. "My name is Edna Garner. I need shelter for one night, and I will be gone before your roosters crow." James Crawford was 31 years old, a man built from years of hard ranch work, with broad shoulders and hands roughened by rope and fence wire, and the kind of labor that never really ended. He had lived alone on the Crawford ranch since his father passed 2 years prior, working the land with 2 hired hands and a cook who went home to town on Sundays. He was not a man given to quick decisions, and he stood in the doorway for a moment longer than was polite, studying her face in the lamplight that leaked past him from inside, the rain hammering the porch roof above them both. "Come in," he said finally, stepping aside, because whatever questions he had could wait until the baby was warm and the woman was no longer shaking herself apart. She stepped inside without another word, and the warmth of the house, modest but genuine, seemed to hit her all at once because she exhaled in a long, trembling breath and pressed her lips against the top of the baby's head, as if making sure it was still there. "Sit down," James said, already moving toward the fireplace to stoke the coals back into a proper blaze. "There is coffee left on the stove from supper. It will be strong, but it is hot." "Hot is all I need," she said, and she sat down in the armchair nearest the fire, the baby still against her chest, and closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds before opening them again, as if she could not afford to let her guard down for longer than that. James poured 2 cups of coffee, set one on the small table beside her within easy reach, and sat down across from her with his own cup in both hands. The fire popped and spit, and outside the thunder moved on east, taking the worst of the storm with it, though the rain continued steady and soft. The baby stirred, made a small noise like a question, and Edna shifted her hold, patting its back with practiced ease. A boy James could see now, with a round face and tiny fists that had curled tight in sleep. "How old is he?" James asked. 4 months, she said. "His name is William." "Yours is a fine name," James said, meaning it because in 1878 in Kerr County, Texas, you learned to read people quickly or you paid for the mistake. He had looked at her long enough to decide she was not a thief, not a woman running a con, and not someone likely to bring trouble down on his door that she had not already brought down on herself. "Where are you headed, Miss Garner?" She looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup, and in that look there was a kind of measuring, the same kind he had applied to her, and he respected her for it. "I was headed to a town called Fredericksburg," she said. "I have a cousin there, or I believed I did. I received a letter in the spring saying she had moved on to San Antonio. I did not find that out until I arrived in Fredericksburg 3 days ago." "And your husband?" James asked, keeping his voice neutral because the baby changed the nature of every assumption a man might otherwise make. Something moved across her face, a complicated thing that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but something in between. "He is dead," she said simply. 6 weeks ago." "I am sorry," James said. "You do not need to be," she said, and the way she said it told him that the death was not a wound she was nursing with tenderness. She looked down at William's sleeping face. He left us in a difficult situation, and I have been trying to work out of it." James nodded and did not press further. A man who pressed a woman at midnight in a thunderstorm for details she had not offered was not a man worth trusting, and he already understood, from the way she had given her name and the way she held herself, that she needed him to be someone worth trusting. He showed her to the small spare room at the back of the house, the one that had been his sister's before she married a man in San Antonio and moved away 4 years ago. It still had the patchwork quilt his mother had made, faded to soft pinks and creams, and a proper wooden cradle in the corner that had been James's own cradle as a baby and had never been moved. "The cradle," Edna said, stopping in the doorway. "It is there for using," James said. "Put William in it. The mattress is stuffed fresh. I restuffed it last autumn." She turned to look at him, and for a moment she was just a very tired young woman holding a baby in a borrowed name, and something in his chest did something he had not expected and could not immediately name. "Thank you, Mr. Crawford," she said quietly. "Sleep," he said. "We can talk tomorrow." He pulled the door shut and went back to the main room, sat down in front of the fire, and stayed there for a long time, not sleeping, listening to the rain, and trying to understand why the sound of her voice saying his name had settled into him the way a good song settles, with roots. When morning came, it came clear and washed clean, the sky a brilliant September blue above the live oaks, and James found Edna already up and in his kitchen, having located the iron skillet and the salt pork and the dried corn meal with the efficiency of a woman who had been feeding herself with whatever was available for a good while. "I hope you do not mind," she said, not turning from the stove. She had braided her hair and her dress had dried overnight, and she had clearly rinsed her face and hands because she looked put together in a way that last night had made seem impossible. "I do not mind," James said, taking his usual chair at the kitchen table. "You did not have to do that." "I pay my way," she said, in a tone that allowed no argument. William was in a basket near the kitchen hearth, awake and quietly studying the world with the grave seriousness of a 4-month-old who has decided that observation is the best strategy. James looked at the boy and found himself smiling in spite of himself. "What is his full name?" James asked. "William Charles Garner," she said. He noticed she had given the boy her own last name, not a father's name. He filed that away alongside everything else. They ate breakfast together, the corn cakes she made coming out better than the ones James made himself, which he told her honestly, and she gave him a small sideways look that might have been the beginning of a smile. After they ate, he poured more coffee and said, "Tell me about your situation." "Not because I am asking you to, but because I want to see if there is any help I can offer before you walk back out onto that road." She was quiet for a moment, both hands around her cup, and he could see her deciding how much to trust him. Then she said, "My husband's name was Roy Callum. I married him 2 years ago in Missouri when I was 21. He was a charming man, and I was young enough to confuse charm for character." She paused. "He was not a good man, Mr. Crawford. He drank and he gambled, and by the time I understood the full scope of it, I was carrying William. We came west because he owed money to men in Missouri who were not patient men." "How did he die?" James asked. "He rode out one morning to meet a man he said was a business associate, and he did not come back. A farmer found him 2 days later on the road to Bowen. His horse was gone, and so was his wallet and his pocket watch." She said it matter-of-factly, but her hands tightened briefly around the cup. "The sheriff said it was likely a robbery gone wrong. I think Roy probably tried to cheat whoever killed him and lost the gamble." James said nothing for a moment. Then, "And the name? You gave me Garner last night. That is not Callum." She met his eyes steadily. "Garner was my family name before I married. I have been using it again since Roy died. He is not here to object, and I will not saddle William with the name of a man who left us nothing but debt." James Crawford looked at this woman who had shown up at his door in a thunderstorm with a baby and a name she had taken back rather than borrowed, and he felt something that he recognized after a moment as profound respect. "All right," he said. Here is what I see. You have no money, no destination, and a 4-month-old baby. The nearest town is Kerrville, 7 miles east on the River Road. I am going into town this Thursday for feed and supplies. If you want a ride, you can have it. If you need work in the meantime, I have a cook named Mrs. Haverford who comes in 5 days a week, but the woman can barely manage the kitchen on top of everything else, and my house is a disaster. I will pay fair wages for 3 days' work, and then you can go to town and find a proper position if you like. Edna Garner studied him for a long moment with those steady brown eyes. Why would you do that for a stranger? Because it is the right thing to do, James said simply. And because my mother raised me to know the difference between a person in trouble and a person looking to cause trouble, and you are clearly the former. She looked at him for another beat, then gave a single nod. Then I accept. Thank you, Mr. Crawford. James, he said, if you are going to be working in my house, you might as well call me James. The corner of her mouth lifted just barely. All right. James. Those 3 days turned into something entirely different, and they did it so gradually that neither of them could have pointed to the exact moment the change began. James told himself it was practical, because Edna was extraordinarily capable, the kind of capable that comes from having had to be, and she put his house in better order in 2 days than it had been in since his mother died 6 years ago. She did not complain about any task. She did not ask for things she had not been offered, and she managed William with a calm competence that spoke of a woman who had been alone with a baby for a long time and had made peace with it. But it was more than that, and James knew it. He caught himself inventing reasons to come back to the house in the middle of the day. He found himself telling her things over supper that he had not told another living person, small things at first, that the west pasture fence was giving him trouble, that he was thinking of expanding the cattle herd in spring, that he missed his sister Clara's letters which had grown shorter over the years. And she listened in the way that some people listened, not waiting for her turn to speak, but actually absorbing what he said. And then she would respond with something that showed she had heard the real thing underneath the words. On the second evening she told him more, unprompted, and he understood it as a gift of trust. She had grown up in Iowa, she said, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who ran the house like a small kingdom. She had always been clever with her hands and her head both, and she had wanted to teach school herself, but she had met Roy Callum at 21 and let herself be talked out of that particular future. He was very handsome and very sure of himself, she said, rocking William on her knee in the lamplight. I mistook certainty for wisdom. They are not the same thing at all. No, James agreed. They are not. What about you? She asked. Have you always been here on this ranch? Born here, he said. My father built the house. My grandfather came to Texas from Tennessee in 1845, 2 years before it was a state, and he chose this valley because of the river and the limestone and the way the light falls in the afternoon. I used to think I understood that, and then I grew up and I really understood it. She smiled, a real one this time, and it did something considerable to his chest. It is beautiful country, she said. Even in the rain. On Thursday morning, as promised, James hitched the buckboard and drove Edna and William into Kerrville. It was a proper enough town by 1878 standards, with a main street of limestone and wood frame buildings, a general store, a post office, a hardware merchant, a doctor's office, 2 saloons, a church, and a small hotel that also functioned as a boarding house. James did his supply business and then walked with Edna to the hotel to speak with the proprietress, a stout and practical woman named Mrs. Dolan, about the possibility of a room. Mrs. Dolan looked at Edna, looked at William, looked at James, and asked the question with her eyebrows. Miss Garner is a widow, James said. She is new to this part of Texas and looking for respectable work and housing. I have a room on the 2nd floor, Mrs. Dolan said, her voice not unkind. Small, but it will hold a cot for the baby. $3 a month, meals included. Edna's face did not change, but James could see the rapid arithmetic happening behind her eyes. $3 a month was money she did not presently have. "I will cover the first month," James said before he had finished deciding to say it. Edna turned to look at him sharply. "As a loan," he added, meeting her eyes. "You can pay it back when you are situated." The sharpness in her expression softened into something careful and complicated. "That is very generous," she said. "It is practical," he said, which was at least partially true. Mrs. Dahlen, who had been in the boarding house business long enough to recognize the unmistakable signs of a man in the early stages of feeling more than he had yet admitted, said nothing except to show them the room and collect the $3 from James's coat pocket. The room was small but clean, with a window that looked out over the river bend, and Edna stood at that window holding William against her shoulder and looked at the water for a long moment. "I will find work," she said. "I am good with a needle and thread, or I could take in washing, or if there is a school that needs a teacher's assistant." "There is a school," James said. "I know the schoolmaster. His name is Herbert Crane. He is a fair man, and he has been struggling without help since his assistant left in June to get married. I will speak to him if you like." She turned from the window. The September afternoon light was coming in over her shoulder, and it lit her face in a way that made James extremely conscious of standing too close and not close enough at the same time. "You have done a great deal for me already," she said. "I am aware of that," he said. "And I am also aware that I have my own reasons, which I will not pretend are entirely selfless, for wanting you to stay in a place where I am likely to see you again." It was, perhaps, the most direct thing he had ever said to a woman, and he was not entirely sure where it had come from, except that Edna Garner seemed to inspire a particular kind of honesty in him, the kind that lived below the careful Texas reserve he usually maintained. She looked at him, and there was something new in her face, something that was not the careful measuring of the first night, but something softer and more uncertain, the look of a person who has been alone for long enough that the offer of not being alone anymore is both desperately welcome and frightening. "I would like you to speak to Mr. Crane," she said at last. Herbert Crane was agreeable to the point of enthusiasm, because he was an overworked man who recognized competence when it walked through his door. He hired Edna on a trial basis starting the following Monday, at a wage that, while modest, was enough, combined with the boarding house room, to make a life on. James witnessed the handshake and felt something settle in him, a satisfaction that he did not entirely have a name for yet. He visited Kerrville the following Sunday, ostensibly to attend the church service, which he did occasionally when the work allowed. He found Edna at the service, seated near the back with William in her arms, and sat down beside her in a way that felt so natural that neither of them remarked on it. 3 old women in the row ahead of them turned around and looked, which was its own kind of social notation, and James looked back at them with calm pleasantry until they turned forward again. After the service, they walked together along the river, William asleep in the sling Edna had fashioned from a length of cotton cloth, and they talked for 2 hours with the easy continuity of people who have established a rhythm together without quite meaning to. She told him about her first days at the school, about a boy named Peter Holt who was 12 years old and mathematically gifted, but convinced he was stupid, and how she had spent 3 evenings working out a method of explaining long division that finally made his face change. James told her about the west fence, which he and his hired hand Reuben had spent the week repairing in the post-storm mud, and about the cattle, and about his father's old journal that he had found in the barn tack room and had been reading in the evenings. "He writes about my mother," James said, "the way a young man writes about a woman he has just understood he loves. It is something, reading it now. He never talked about feelings. I did not know until now that he felt them that specifically." Edna glanced at him. "That must be a gift, finding that." "It is," he said. "It makes him a person in a way that just remembering him did not quite accomplish." She nodded, and he saw that she understood exactly what he meant, and the understanding moved through him like warm light. He came back the next Sunday and the one after that. The 3rd Sunday he brought her a book, a collection of poetry that he had ordered through the general store merchant, because she had mentioned in passing that she had loved her father's poetry collection and had left it behind when she left Missouri. It was a small thing, a volume of Tennyson, nothing extravagant, but when he held it out to her she took it with both hands and looked at it as if he had handed her something precious, which perhaps in its way he had. "James," she said. "It is nothing," he said, which they both knew was not true. She looked up at him, and the October wind came down the river valley and moved the loose hair at her temples, and he thought she was, quite simply, the most interesting person he had ever been in the same room with, or the same stretch of riverside, or the same piece of the world. "It is not nothing," she said quietly. "I want you to know that I see what you are doing, and I want you to know that I am not afraid of it. I am only going slowly because I promised myself after Roy that I would go slowly, that any man who wanted my good opinion would have to earn it over time." "I know," James said. "I am a patient man, Edna. I have spent my whole life working land that takes years to show you what it intends, and I have learned that what comes slowly is worth more than what comes fast." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something that surprised him. She reached out and took his hand briefly, a single firm squeeze, and then released it and looked back at the river. "Then we understand each other," she said. "We do," he said, and felt the warmth of that brief contact in his hand for the rest of the afternoon. October moved into November, and with the cooling of the air came a change in the shape of things. The school term was well underway, and Edna had become, in the eyes of Kerrville's small community, a fixture of respectable reliability. Herbert Crane had begun paying her slightly more after the first month because, as he told James privately when they ran into each other at the hardware store, he did not want to lose her to some other arrangement before he had fully appreciated what he had. William, growing and increasingly opinionated about the world, had charmed Mrs. Dolan past all her initial caution, and the boarding-house proprietress had taken to keeping the boy in the mornings while Edna was at the school, an arrangement that Edna paid for in sewing and mending rather than cash, which suited them both. James came to town every Sunday and sometimes on a weekday when the work allowed, and he and Edna had established a routine that felt, to anyone watching, like a courtship, which it was, though neither of them had yet applied that word aloud. In November he met her past for the first time in the form of a letter. He was with her at the boarding-house parlor one evening when Mrs. Dolan brought in the mail, and among it was a letter addressed in a hand Edna clearly recognized, because her face changed in a very specific way when she saw it, the careful stillness of someone who has learned to manage their reactions before they decide what to feel. "From Missouri?" James asked. "From Roy's brother," she said. "Thomas Callum." She opened it with neat, contained movements and read it with that same stillness. James waited. "He says he has heard that Roy died," she said finally. "He says that as Roy's surviving heir, he has a claim to any property Roy may have left, including any children." The temperature in James's chest dropped several degrees. "He is claiming William. He is suggesting it," she said, her voice measured. "He says the boy should be raised by the Callum family as Roy would have wanted." She set the letter down on the table with the deliberate care of a woman keeping her hand steady by choice. "Roy would have wanted nothing of the sort. Roy barely looked at William before he rode out that last morning." "Can this Thomas Callum make such a claim legally?" James asked. "I do not know the law here as well as I should," she said. "I know that in Missouri a woman's rights over her children were not always what they ought to be, but Texas may be different." James thought about what he knew, which was not extensive but was more than nothing. He thought about his neighbor, a man named Gordon Whitfield who had studied some law before he came west and took up ranching instead. "I know a man who can advise us," he said. "He is not a practicing lawyer, but he knows enough to tell us what the situation actually is." She looked at him. "Us," she said. He met her eyes. "Yes, us." She said nothing for a moment, and then she picked up the letter and folded it precisely along its existing creases and set it aside. "I would like very much to speak to your friend," she said. Gordon Whitfield, who was 60 years old and had the cautious thoroughness of a man who had spent time around courts, listened to the situation with the letter on the table in front of him, and then said, slowly and carefully, that in Texas in 1878, a mother's claim to her child was strongest when the child had been in her sole care, and when there was no evidence of legal abandonment or incompetence. Thomas Callum's claim, based purely on being the uncle of a child whose father had died in somewhat murky circumstances, was weak at best, particularly since he had no established relationship with William and lived in another state. "However," Gordon said, looking at Edna with the directness of a man who is about to say something she needs to hear whether she likes it or not, "a woman alone with an infant in the frontier West is in a more legally precarious position than she would be in a settled eastern city. Courts here are not always consistent, and a determined man with resources can sometimes make problems that the law alone cannot efficiently solve." Edna received this without visible distress. "What would strengthen my position?" Gordon glanced at James and then back at Edna. "Roots," he said. "Community standing, a household, a name with legal standing in this county." There was a silence in Gordon Whitfield's study that stretched long enough to be its own kind of conversation. James drove Edna back to town that evening with William asleep between them on the buckboard seat, and they went most of the way without speaking, which was not an uncomfortable silence but a thinking one, two people working through the same question from their respective positions. As they came into the edge of Kerrville and the lights of the main street appeared in the early dark, James said, "I want to say something and I want you to hear it the way it is meant, which is honestly and without any pressure attached to it." "All right," Edna said. "I have been coming to see you every week for 2 months," he said, keeping his eyes on the road and his voice even. "I have thought about you every day between visits. I think you are the best person I have met in a decade of meeting people, and I think William is a fine boy, and I think my ranch is too large and too quiet for one man. I am not saying this because of the letter, though the letter has made me want to say it sooner than I might have otherwise. I am saying it because it is true, and because I believe you deserve to hear true things from men, since you have apparently not always gotten that." Edna was looking at him with an expression he had not seen on her before, open in a way that she did not usually permit herself to be. "I am not asking you to decide anything tonight," he continued. "I am asking you to consider the possibility that what has been growing between us for 2 months is something worth acting on, and that acting on it would serve both of us and William in ways that go beyond the practical, though the practical is also there, and I am not pretending otherwise." She was quiet for a long moment after he stopped speaking. The horse's hooves clocked steady on the packed road. "I think about you between visits too," she said at last, with the directness that was so particularly her own. "I have been trying not to, because I told myself I would not be rushed into anything by circumstance. But there is a difference, I think, between being rushed by circumstance and recognizing that circumstance has aligned with something you were already feeling." He brought the buckboard to a stop in front of the boarding house. The lamp above the door was lit, and the street was quiet. "That is a wise distinction," he said. "I am a wise woman," she said, with a small and genuine smile. He looked at her in the lamplight, this woman who had walked out of a thunderstorm and into his door and into his life, with her borrowed name and her sleeping baby and her extraordinary stubborn capability, and he said carefully, "Will you marry me, Edna Garner? Not because of Thomas Callum, not because it is sensible. Because I think you are remarkable, and because I intend to go on thinking so for a very long time, and I would rather do that as your husband than as a man who visits on Sundays and wishes he were more." She looked at him for a long, still moment, and in that moment he saw the calculations and the fears and the pride and the longing all moving through her face in quick succession, and then they settled and she said, "Yes, I will marry you, James Crawford." He reached out and took her hand, and this time she did not let go after a moment. They were married on the first Saturday of December, 1878, in the Kerrville Church, with a congregation of approximately 20 people who had, in the compressed social ecology of a small Texas town, formed strong opinions about this development in the 2 weeks since word got around. Mrs. Dahlin was there, beaming with the satisfaction of a woman who had seen it coming. Herbert Crane came with his wife. Reuben, James's hired hand, stood in the back with his hat in both hands. Gordon Whitfield sat in the third row with his wife Alina and looked like a man who felt his legal advice had been put to excellent use. Edna wore a dress of deep blue wool that she and Mrs. Dahlin had made together in the 2 weeks since the engagement, working evenings at the parlor table while William slept. And her hair was up, and she held a small cluster of late autumn wildflowers that James had found along the creek that morning with rather more care and intent than he usually applied to that stretch of land. She walked into that church with William on her hip, because she would not hand him to anyone for this moment, and she walked toward James Crawford with the steady, level gaze of a woman who had made her decision with her full mind and was not second-guessing a single part of it. James, standing at the front of the church in his good black coat, watched her come down the aisle and felt something happen in his chest that he would later describe to Gordon Whitfield, when the two of them were sharing a whiskey on a fence post at some future point, as the sensation of all the pieces of a thing clicking into their correct positions at the same moment. The Reverend John Tate, a lean man with an honest face, performed the ceremony with appropriate gravity and appropriate warmth, and when he said the words that made them husband and wife, James slid a simple gold band onto Edna's finger, a ring that had been his mother's, and that he had retrieved from the box in his bureau drawer the night before, holding it in his palm for a long time before deciding that his mother would have approved of this particular use. Edna looked at the ring on her finger and then at James, and her eyes were bright, and she said, very quietly so only he could hear, "Your name is a good name. I am glad to take it this time." He kissed her, there in the church, with William between them making a small interrogative noise about the whole proceeding, and the 20 people behind them made the kind of collective warm sounds that communities make when they have witnessed something that feels right. Thomas Callum's letter, when James wrote back to it 3 days after the wedding, was answered with the facts. Edna was now Mrs. James Crawford of Kerr County, Texas, wife of a property-owning cattle rancher in good standing, and William Charles Crawford, as he was now enrolled at the school, was her son and James's legally acknowledged stepchild. The letter was written with Gordon Whitfield's assistance to ensure it said everything it needed to say in legal terms and nothing more. They never received another letter from Missouri. They moved Edna and William's few possessions out to the ranch on a clear December morning, James carrying the cot and the small trunk, Edna carrying William and the book of Tennyson, and when she walked through the front door of the Crawford Ranch house as its mistress rather than its guest, she stopped in the middle of the main room and turned around once slowly, looking at it. "What are you doing?" James asked, setting down the cot. "I am deciding where things should go," she said. He laughed, a full and easy laugh, and she smiled at the sound of it. December settled over the hill country with a quiet that James had previously experienced as loneliness and now experienced as peace. The house, which had been merely functional for 2 years, became a home in the way that homes become homes, not through the acquisition of new things but through the arrival of living. Edna moved through it with the confidence of a woman reclaiming something that should always have been hers, not this house specifically, but the kind of life that a house like this represented. Steadiness, safety, the orderly warmth of a place where the fire was kept and the table was set, and the person who came in from the cold was greeted by someone who had been looking for them. William, for his part, adapted to the ranch with the flexible pragmatism of a 5-month-old, which is to say that he adapted to it completely. He had James's full, uncomplicated attention whenever James came in from the day's work, which surprised Edna the first time she saw it. A big rancher sitting on the floor of the main room with a baby on his knee, apparently conducting a serious one-sided conversation about the condition of the North pasture. "He is a very good listener," James said, without embarrassment. "He is," Edna agreed, and the look she gave James in that moment had things in it that she had not yet found words for. Christmas came, modest and genuine. James found a small cedar tree in the creek bottom and cut it and stood it in the corner, and Edna fashioned decorations from ribbon and scraps of cloth and a string of dried berries. And on Christmas Eve they sat by the fire with William asleep between them on the settle and the cedar tree smelling of the hill country dark outside. And James read aloud from his father's journal, the entry from the Christmas of 1851. When his father had been young and the ranch was new, and the world had seemed enormous and possible. He writes, James said, that he looked out at the land in the evening light and thought that if he could fill it with enough love it would hold, that a ranch was not made of cattle or fence or water rights, but of love applied to it over enough years. Edna was quiet for a moment. "Your father was a poet. He was a rancher who kept a journal," James said, "which amounts to much the same thing out here." She leaned her head against his shoulder, a thing she had been doing more freely in the past weeks, with the ease of a woman finding her way into a comfort she had not entirely trusted herself to want, and he put his arm around her and they sat like that for a long while in the cedar-scented quiet. "I am glad I knocked on your door," she said. "I am glad you did too," he said. "Though I think if you had not found my door you would have found a way through regardless. You are that kind of person." "Maybe," she said, "but I am glad it was your door." The new year came, 1879, and with it the rhythms of the ranch in winter, the cattle work and the fence work and the planning for spring. Edna kept her position at the school through the end of the school term in March, riding into town 3 days a week with James, or, on the days he could not take her, with Reuben, who was a quiet and reliable man from Georgia who had come west after the war, and found that the hills of Texas suited his particular kind of silence. Reuben, James noticed, had developed a cautious respect for Edna that expressed itself in small practical attentions, making sure the buckboard step was steady, keeping the horses well behaved, asking once and only once if the pace was comfortable for the baby on cold mornings. Edna, who had a gift for recognizing honest people, treated him with straightforward warmth, and the three of them developed the easy working relationship of people who have decided to trust each other. The second hired hand was a younger man, 20 years old, named Charlie Peck, who came from a ranching family in Burnett and had taken work with James the previous spring. Charlie was cheerful and capable and had an irrepressible tendency to whistle while he worked, which James tolerated with good humor and which William, by February, was clearly attempting to imitate, producing small formless sounds that bore no resemblance to a melody but were clearly musical in intent. "He is going to be a whistler," James told Edna one evening, watching the boy on the blanket near the fire, moving his mouth experimentally. "The Crawford Ranch will be very musical," Edna said. "Is that a complaint?" "It is a delight," she said, and James looked at her and thought, not for the first time, how much of her she kept contained by habit and how good it was, every time a piece of it came out unconstrained. It was in February that the question of Roy Callum surfaced one more time, not through another letter from Thomas, but through a man who arrived in Kerrville and began asking questions. His name, James learned from the Kerrville postmaster, who was a reliable conduit of information in a small town, was Frank Delaney, and he had come down from San Antonio and was looking, it seemed, for a woman and a baby. He was staying at the less reputable of the two saloons, and he had been heard asking about a widow named Callum or Garner. James heard this on a Wednesday and came home to the ranch that evening without telling Edna immediately, wanting first to understand what he was dealing with. He rode to Gordon Whitfield's place the next morning, and Gordon listened to the description and said slowly that it sounded like the sort of man who was either a debt collector for Roy Callum's creditors or someone Thomas Callum had sent to assess the situation in person. Either way, Gordon said, his business is with people who no longer exist. Roy Callum is dead. Edna Callum is now Edna Crawford, and William is your acknowledged son. There is no legal claim any of these men can make. I know that, James said, but I want Edna to hear it before she hears about Delaney some other way. He told her that evening after supper with William settled for the night, and he watched her face go through several things quickly. Fear was there briefly, and then it was replaced by something harder and steadier. What does he want? She asked. I believe he is either a creditor's man or Thomas Callum's man. Either way, he has nothing enforceable. Roy had debts, she said. I knew that. I do not know how large they were because he never told me the full truth of anything. Debts were Roy's debts, James said. Not yours. You were never party to the agreements he made, and you hold no property that was his. I will go into town tomorrow and speak to this man directly. I will come with you, she said immediately. He looked at her. Edna. I will come with you, she said again, with the particular finality that he had come to recognize as the sound of a decision made and done with. He has come here about me. If there is something to face, I will face it. I have not come this far by letting other people handle what is mine to handle. He nodded. All right, we will both go. Frank Delaney turned out to be a thin man in his 40s with a salesman's careful manners, and the eyes of a man who made his living in the narrow spaces between legal and not. He met them in the lobby of the hotel, because James had sent word through Mrs. Dolan that he wished to speak with the stranger in a public and respectable place, which was a message Delaney would have understood clearly. They sat at the parlor table with Mrs. Dolan present at her desk in the corner, her very presence a statement about the character of the establishment and the standing of its guests. Delaney looked at Edna and at James with the calculating assessment of his profession, and then said, with studied pleasantness, that he was acting as a representative of the estate of a Mr. Roy Callum, attempting to locate assets that might satisfy outstanding debts. James let the man finish and then said, in the level and unhurried tone he used when a situation required weight rather than heat, My wife, Mrs. James Crawford, has no assets from Roy Callum's estate, because Roy Callum died without property and with debts that exceeded anything he owned. Any claims his creditors hold are against his estate, which contains nothing, and have no bearing on my wife or my son. If you have a different understanding, I would suggest you speak to a Texas lawyer and have him explain the law of this state to you, which I suspect may differ from what you were told in Missouri. Delaney looked at him for a moment, then at Edna, then back at James. There is also the matter of the child, Delaney said. There is no matter of the child, James said. William Crawford is my acknowledged son. I have documentation at the county records office in Kerrville filed last month. He is not a Callum. He has never been a Callum. He will not be discussed. Delaney absorbed this. The calculation in his eyes ran its course and reached a conclusion that any practical man would have reached, which was that this particular errand was not going to produce anything useful. I will need to relay this to my clients, he said. Relay it, James said. And relay also that any further interference in the lives of my wife and son will be met with the full force of Texas law, which includes charges of harassment and trespass, as my neighbor Mr. Gordon Whitfield, who has studied law, would be happy to formalize. Delaney left Kerrville the next morning. They never saw or heard from him or Thomas Callum again. On the ride home from that meeting, Edna was quiet for a long stretch of river road, and then she said, You called William your son. He is my son, James said simply. She turned to look at him, and her eyes were very bright in the February light. Legally and otherwise, James continued. He is 4 months old, which means he will know no other father, and I intend that he should have nothing to regret on that account. He is my son, Edna. That is not a concession or a strategy. It is a fact. She reached over and took his hand where it held the reins, and he turned his palm over and held hers, and they drove the rest of the way home in the particular silence of two people who have said the most important things and do not need to add anything further. March came with the wildflowers, bluebonnets along every fence line and Indian paintbrush in the pastures, and the hill country showed itself at its best, which was spectacular. The cattle moved through the spring grass with the satisfaction of animals whose world had improved, and the ranch had a rightness to it that James had not felt in years. Edna's school term ended in late March, and she did not renew her contract, partly because Herbert Crane had, after some difficulty, found a properly trained schoolteacher from San Antonio, and partly because the ranch itself was demanding more of her time. She had ideas about the kitchen garden, which had been left to grow over, and about the chicken situation, which was informal to the point of randomness, and about the interior of the house, which was functional but could be genuinely comfortable with some attention. She threw herself into the ranch with the same focused energy she had applied to the school, and James watched this with a deep satisfaction, because there was something about seeing a person inhabit a place with full conviction that told you the place was where they were supposed to be. William, by March and nearly 7 months old, had developed a distinct personality characterized by curiosity, sociability, and an extremely strong opinion about being left out of anything interesting. He had also developed an attachment to James that expressed itself in the particular way babies expressed attachment, with arms extended, and a sound that was clearly a name even if the articulation of it was still some months away. Edna watched her son reach for James one April morning and felt something in her chest that was not complicated at all. Spring deepened, and with it something between Edna and James deepened too, into a warmth that was less the careful, cautious thing of the courtship months, and more the settled, rooted kind of love that grows when two people have faced hard things together and found each other steady. They talked in the evenings with the ease of people who have run out of reasons to be guarded. They worked beside each other with the efficiency of partners who have mapped each other's rhythms. And there were evenings, the kind that the hill country specializes in producing, when the sky went all rose and gold above the limestone, and the air smelled of cedar and the cattle were settled and William was asleep, when James and Edna sat on the porch together, and the silence between them was so full it needed nothing added to it. In May, Edna told James she was expecting another child. She told him at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, directly and without preamble because that was her way, and she watched his face while she did it. James Crawford's face in that moment was a remarkable thing to watch. It went through surprise and then something that was not quite joy and not quite awe but something between them, something that had no good word for it in English, and then it settled into a smile that was the realest thing she had ever seen on a human face. "Are you well?" he asked first. "I am perfectly well," she said. "Good," he said, and then he was around the table and she was standing and his arms were around her and his face was in her hair, and he said against the top of her head, "Edna, Edna, that is wonderful." She held on to him and laughed, the full, unguarded laugh that she had been building toward for months, the one that had been waiting since the thunderstorm, and it came out now into the warm May morning and seemed to belong there. That summer was the best summer James Crawford had ever spent on the ranch that had been his family's home, since before Texas was a state. He worked the cattle and the land with the particular energy of a man for whom work has become an act of love rather than mere survival, building something that had a future now, something that was worth building because there were people who would inhabit it after him. Reuben and Charlie Peck managed their share of the labor with good spirits, and the ranch in 1879 was in better order than it had been since James's father was at his prime. Edna ran the household with a steady hand and an inventive mind, the kitchen garden producing more than they could eat so that she began putting up preserves in quantities that filled the cool cellar room with ordered rows of labeled jars. She kept accounts with a precision that James found both impressive and slightly humbling, because he had been keeping accounts the way his father did, which was approximately, and Edna's version of approximately was several significant improvements on his. "Where did you learn bookkeeping?" he asked her one evening, watching her make entries in the household ledger. "My father taught school," she said, without looking up. He believed girls and boys should learn the same things. He was unusual in that belief, and I have been grateful for it my entire life. He sounds like a fine man, James said. He was the finest man I knew, she said, and then she looked up at him. Until recently. James was quiet for a moment. You should write to him, he said, if he is still living. He is, she said. I wrote to him in January. I told him about you. What did you say? She smiled at him across the ledger. I said I had found a man who was honest and steady and kind, and that he had claimed both me and my son without condition, and that I was happier than I had been since I left home. He looked at her for a long moment. Did he write back? He did, she said. He said any man who would claim both without condition was a man worth keeping. James laughed. I like your father. You will get to meet him, she said. I have written asking if he would come west in the autumn, once the baby is here and settled. James felt the warmth of that, the shape of a future filling in with people and affection and connection. Good, he said. That is very good. The baby came in December, on a cold, clear night when the stars over the hill country were enormous, and the cedar logs in the fireplace burned sweet and bright. James paced the main room while Mrs. Dolan, who had driven out from town to attend, managed things in the bedroom with the calm authority of a woman who had been present at many births. Reuben and Charlie Peck were in the barn, because the hands had an instinct about when to be useful in a different direction. The baby announced himself at 11 o'clock at night with a sound that cut right through the walls, and James stopped pacing and stood still in the middle of the room and felt the world change shape. Mrs. Dolan opened the bedroom door and said, "A boy, Mr. Crawford. Both fine." He went in, and Edna was propped against the pillows with a bundle against her chest, and she looked up when he came through the door with a face that was exhausted and luminous in equal measure. The baby was red-faced and absolutely certain of his own opinions already, and James sat on the edge of the bed and looked at this new person who had arrived into their lives and felt something that was entirely beyond words. He looks like he intends to have views about things, James said. All Crawfords apparently do, Edna said with a tired and radiant smile. What shall we call him? She looked at him. I thought Thomas, she said. After your father. James's father had been Thomas Crawford. James looked at his wife and his son and said, Thomas Crawford. That is a good, solid name. It is, she said. William needs a brother with a solid name to keep him in line. James leaned forward and kissed her forehead carefully, and she leaned into it with her eyes closed for a moment. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? She murmured. For knocking on my door, he said. She opened her eyes and looked at him with all of it there. All of the months of careful trust building and the fear overcome and the love that had grown from two strangers in a thunderstorm into this bedroom on a December night with a new baby and a sleeping William in the next room, and the cedar fire keeping them warm. Thank you for opening it, she said. Edna's father, Samuel Garner, arrived in February of 1880, making the journey by rail as far as San Antonio and then by coach to Kerrville, where James met him at the stage and brought him out to the ranch. He was a tall, thin man of 60, with silver hair and her same steady brown eyes, and he looked at the hill country with the appreciation of a man who recognizes beautiful country when it presents itself. He looked at James with the thorough assessment of a father evaluating the man who had claimed his daughter and her son, and James met it steadily because there was nothing in his life, at this point, that he needed to obscure or defend. She wrote that you were honest and kind, Samuel Garner said on the porch of the ranch house, while inside Edna was putting both boys down for their afternoon sleep. I try to be, James said. She said you claimed both of them, no hesitation. William is my son, James said. There was nothing to hesitate about. Samuel Garner looked at him for a long moment with the eyes that were his daughter's eyes, and then he extended his hand, and James took it, and the old man's grip was firm and warm. She chose better this time, Samuel said simply. I know it was not easy what she went through, James said. No, Samuel said, it was not. But she is her mother's daughter, and her mother could have bent in a hurricane and stood right back up when it passed. He looked out at the pastures, the cattle in the afternoon light. She looks happy. That is what a father wants to see. I intend that she should stay that way, James said. Samuel Garner stayed 3 weeks, and in that time James came to know him as a man worth knowing, sharp-minded and quietly funny, and possessed of the gift that Edna had clearly inherited, the ability to listen with complete attention. He spent hours with William, teaching the boy, now 14 months old and walking with determined unsteadiness, simple clapping games and songs from Iowa that William apparently found completely satisfactory. He held baby Thomas with the practiced ease of a man who had held babies before and found them, on the whole, a good idea. He and James sat on the porch in the evenings and talked about many things: land and education and the state of Texas and the nature of the West and the particular kind of life that the frontier demanded and in return provided. She would have been a teacher, Samuel said one evening. A fine one. She had my gift for explaining things, but more patience than I ever had. She still teaches, James said. Not at a school anymore, but she has been teaching William his letters since he was 10 months old, and I think she teaches me something every week whether she intends to or not. Samuel laughed, a laugh with Edna's quality to it. Yes, that sounds right. When Samuel left to return to Iowa, Edna stood on the porch and watched the buckboard carry him toward the Kerrville road, and James stood beside her. And after the shape of the buckboard disappeared behind the live oaks, she turned and pressed her face briefly against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. "You could write to him about coming to live closer," he said. "San Antonio has schools, good ones. A man with his mind would not want for work." She looked up. "You would not mind." "I would welcome it," he said honestly. "He is a good man, and the boys should know their grandfather." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You are a remarkable man, James Crawford." "I am just a rancher," he said. "You are just a rancher who opened his door at midnight in a thunderstorm to a woman with a baby and a borrowed name, and then proceeded to claim both without condition, and then proceeded to make a family out of all of it," she said. "That is not just a rancher. That is a particular kind of person." He looked at her in the morning light, this woman who was his wife and his partner and the person who had walked into his house and made it into a home, and said, "You made it easy." "I did not," she said with a small smile. "I was extremely difficult about it." "You were appropriately careful," he corrected, "which is different." She laughed and leaned against him, and they stood on the porch of the Crawford Ranch in the February sunshine, and watched a hawk ride the thermal above the east pasture in long, slow spirals. Spring of 1880 brought good rain and good grass and a calf crop that exceeded what James had hoped for, and the ranch went from doing well to doing genuinely prosperously. He began making improvements that had been deferred for years: a new water cistern, an expansion of the main barn, repairs to the bunkhouse where Reuben and Charlie Peck stayed. He hired a third man, an older fellow named Dale, who came with his own horse and a quiet and particular skill with injured cattle. Edna expanded the kitchen garden, which by now she was running with the efficiency of a small agricultural operation, and she began keeping better chickens, replacing the informal scraggly flock with a proper laying breed that she obtained through the Kerrville General Store. The result was more eggs than they could use, which solved itself when she began supplying Mrs. Dahlin and 2 other households in town on a weekly basis, an arrangement that produced a modest additional income and gave Edna the satisfaction of a productive system working as designed. William, 18 months old in the spring of 1880, was a child of determined curiosity and absolute confidence in his own welcome everywhere he went, which was a reflection, James thought, of having been made to feel secure from the beginning. He followed James around the ranch whenever Edna permitted it, which was often, because she had early on understood that this particular bond was something to be cultivated rather than managed. William called James, "Duh," with a clarity that had arrived suddenly at 15 months, and showed no sign of being provisional, and James received it each time as a fresh and genuine grace. Thomas, at 4 months, was a different creature, calmer and more observational than his brother, with a habit of studying whatever was in front of him with a seriousness that made him look, as James told Edna, like a small judge evaluating a complex case. "He will be the philosopher," Edna said. "William will be the argument," James said. "Thomas will be the conclusion," she laughed. "Heaven help us both." In the summer, a letter arrived from Samuel Garner in Iowa saying that he had been offered a position at a school in San Antonio and that he was inclined to take it, and asking whether the Crawford Ranch would be a reasonable base for a man who intended to visit his grandchildren with some regularity. Edna read the letter aloud at the supper table and looked at James when she finished. "Write back and tell him yes," James said. "And tell him he is welcome here whenever he needs a meal and a chair and 2 grandsons who will completely exhaust him." She wrote the letter that evening, smiling the entire time. The years that followed were built of seasons and work and the ordinary, extraordinary texture of a life being lived fully. The ranch grew. The cattle herd expanded. A 4th hired man came on permanently in 1881. A young Mexican man named Esteban who spoke both Spanish and English, and who had an extraordinary way with horses that James recognized as a genuine gift, and paid accordingly, at a rate that was fair in a time when fair wages for Mexican workers were not always guaranteed. A fact James was conscious of, and Edna was more vocal about, because she had inherited her father's belief that a person's work was worth what it was worth regardless of where they had come from. In the autumn of 1881, Edna told James she was expecting again. This time when she told him, he was ready for the feeling, and he received it with the full warmth that the first time had taken him by surprise. "Are you pleased?" she asked, watching him. "I am more than pleased," he said. "I am a very fortunate man." The baby that came in the spring of 1882 was a girl, and they named her Clara, after James's sister in San Antonio, who had come to visit the previous Christmas with her husband, and had spent a full 2 days holding William and Thomas with the yearning of a woman who had not yet been so lucky. Clara, they agreed, was a good name, and the real Clara, when she received the letter, wrote back in a hand that had clearly been unsteady with emotion to say that she was honored, and that she would be on the next coach. Baby Clara was, from the very first day, a person with an absolutely clear idea of the world as she intended it to be, which mostly involved being held and preferably sung to. James, who had no particular singing voice but had a store of his mother's old songs filed somewhere in his memory, retrieved them nightly for this daughter of his and felt, each time she settled against his chest at the sound of them, that he had been given more than he could ever adequately account for. William, 3 years old and fully convinced of his authority over all situations, received his sister with a mix of fascination and mild offense at the redistribution of attention, which resolved itself within a week into a proprietary protectiveness that James recognized as love in the only form a 3-year-old could readily manage. Thomas, 2 years old and still evaluating the world with judicial gravity, looked at Clara for a long time on the day she arrived, and then patted her head very gently and said, with great seriousness, "Baby." It was the most he had said about the matter, and in its way, the most sufficient. Samuel Garner came from San Antonio 3 weeks after Clara arrived, and held his granddaughter in the good chair by the fireplace, and talked to her in the low, precise voice he used for teaching, as if he had decided that the education of Clara Crawford had better start promptly. Edna watched her father with her daughter and thought of Iowa and the schoolhouse in her childhood, and all the long road between that girl and this woman, and she felt the distance not as loss but as the evidence of a life that had been genuinely lived. In the evenings, when the children were asleep and Samuel was reading in the spare room, James and Edna sat on the porch with the last of the day's light above the hills and talked, or did not talk, with equal comfort. Do you remember the first morning? Edna asked him one such evening in the autumn of 1882, when I made corn cakes in your kitchen and you told me they were better than yours. I remember every day, James said. That morning particularly. You had dried your dress and braided your hair and you were making yourself at home in a stranger's kitchen like you had already decided it was going to be all right. I had not decided, she said. I was pretending until I could decide. That is what you do when you have a baby to provide for. You project more certainty than you have and then you grow into it. I did not know you were pretending, he said. You were not supposed to, she said. But now I do not have to. She looked at the hills, darkening to purple in the late light. Now I am actually certain, about all of it, about you, about this place, about what we have built here. He reached over and took her hand on the arm of the porch chair, the way he had done hundreds of times in the years of their marriage, and she laced her fingers through his without looking, the gesture as natural as breathing. I am too, he said, more certain than I have ever been of anything. She turned to look at him, and in the evening light she was as beautiful as she had been in any other light, which was to say entirely, in the specific way of a person you have loved long enough to see in all weathers. You know, she said, I have been thinking about the schoolhouse. He raised an eyebrow. The Kerrville School. There is a subscription school up at the north end of the county, she said, in the Comfort direction. It has not had a teacher in 2 years and the children up there are not getting their education. I talked to Herbert Crane about it last month. What are you thinking? He said, knowing from the quality of her voice that she had already thought it through considerably. 2 days a week, she said. I could ride up in the morning and come back by evening. Esteban could drive me when you cannot. The children here are old enough for it and Mrs. Dolan would come out on those mornings. He looked at her. You want to teach again? I think I do, she said. I love this ranch and I love our life here and I also have a schoolteacher's brain that has been applied mainly to chickens and accounts for 3 years. He laughed. The chickens are extremely well educated. She grinned at him. James. Of course, he said. Of course you should teach. 2 days a week is perfectly manageable. He paused. And I think you should also talk to the county about formalizing it. If there is a school that needs a teacher, there should be proper funding for it, not just subscription fees from families who may or may not be able to pay. She looked at him with frank approval. You have been paying attention. I have been paying attention to you for 4 years, he said. I have learned a considerable amount. She squeezed his hand. I love you, she said, with the directness that was so peculiarly and perfectly hers. I love you too, he said, with the simplicity that had always been his. More than I could have predicted, which is saying something because I thought I could see it coming. Nobody ever fully sees it coming, she said. That is the most honest thing about love. By 1883, the Crawford Ranch was one of the better regarded operations in Kerr County. Not the largest, but well-run and well-regarded. And the Crawfords themselves had become the kind of family that other families oriented around, the sort of household where people ended up on Sunday afternoons and at Christmas, and when something needed to be decided in the community. It had not been a position James had sought, but it had arrived naturally, the way things arrive when you are known for being reliable and fair. Edna's school at the north end of the county had, with James's encouragement and Gordon Whitfield's legal assistance, become a properly funded public school under the county system by the spring of 1883, with Edna as its official teacher, 3 days a week. She rode up in the buckboard on Monday and Wednesday and Friday, and she taught 14 children ranging in age from 5 to 12, in a one-room building that she had organized to within an inch of its life with charts and slates, and the books that she and James had ordered through the San Antonio book merchant over the winter. Peter Holt, the 12-year-old she had identified as mathematically gifted back in Kerrville 4 years ago, was now 16, and had been in correspondence with a college in Austin about his prospects, because Edna had maintained the connection through Herbert Crane and through letters, and she had written on Peter's behalf to the admissions officer with the conviction and detail of a woman who knew exactly what she was talking about. When the letter came confirming Peter Holt's acceptance to the University of Texas, which had been established in Austin just that year, Edna read it at the kitchen table and put it down and said nothing for a moment. "Good news?" James asked, reading her face. "Peter Holt is going to university," she said. James smiled. "That is largely your doing." "It is entirely his doing," she said firmly. "I only insisted that someone see it." He looked at his wife across the table, in the morning light of their kitchen, in the house that had been his parents' house and was now theirs. And he thought about the midnight thunderstorm and the woman at the door and the baby in the flannel shirt and the borrowed name she had taken back. And he thought about every morning since then, about corn cakes and ledgers and poetry and children, and the particular blue of her eyes when she was pleased about something, which was the same steady deep brown she was born with, but which did something specific in him regardless of how many times he had seen it. "Edna," he said. She looked up from the letter. "I want you to know something," he said. "I want you to know that I have thought about that night, the night you knocked, many times. And every time I think about what would have happened if I had not heard it, or if I had been away at the cattle drive, or if you had passed the lane in the dark and not seen the house." She was watching him with the full attention she gave to important things. "And it seems to me," he said, "that the world arranged it very carefully, and I am grateful every day." She got up from her chair and came around the table and put her arms around him from behind, the way she sometimes did in the mornings before the children were up, resting her chin on the top of his head, and he put his hands over hers where they crossed at his chest. "I think the world arranges things less carefully than we would like to believe," she said, against his hair. "I think mostly things happen and we make of them what we can. But what we have made, you and I think that is considerable." "More than considerable," he said. "A whole life," she said. "That is what we have made." The years continued, and the life they had made in that ranch house in the Texas Hill Country grew and deepened and branched. Samuel Garner relocated to San Antonio permanently in 1884 and visited the ranch 4 times a year, arriving with books for the grandchildren and stories for the evenings, and the particular comfort of a man who was fully at home among the people he loved. He was teaching at a San Antonio school by then, and he and Edna wrote letters to each other between visits that were, she told James, more like proper intellectual conversation than anything else she had access to, which James received without offense because he fully understood that some needs are specific and should be specifically met. William, who turned 5 in 1883 and 6 the following year, was growing into the boy that his earliest months had promised, curious and sociable and good-natured, with a stubborn streak that expressed itself not in temper, but in the quiet persistence of a child who has simply decided how something should be, and is prepared to wait out all alternatives. He had his mother's brown eyes and James's frame, and apparently some ancestor's blonde hair that surprised everyone, and he worked alongside James in the ranch work, whenever he was old enough for any piece of it, with a genuine interest and aptitude that gave James a satisfaction that went very deep. James had told William, when the boy was 4 and asking the questions that 4-year-olds ask, the plain and simple version of the truth, that his first father had died before William could remember him, that James had married his mother and loved them both, and that being a Crawford was something William had chosen just as much as James had chosen it. He had told him this with Edna present and with her full agreement, and William had absorbed it with the equanimity of a child who has no reason to feel the information as anything other than information, because all the feeling in his life had been of the good kind. Thomas, 2 years younger than William, grew into exactly the philosophical, observational creature his infancy had suggested. He was quieter than his brother and more internal, but when he spoke, he had a precision and an aptness that made adults stop and look at each other with the shared recognition of something unexpectedly true. Edna said he would be a writer. James said he would be a lawyer. They agreed that either would suit. Clara, the youngest of the 3, was, by the time she was 3, the absolute sovereign of the household, a position she had achieved through a combination of charm, determination, and the tactical brilliance of a person who understood exactly how to be the youngest and most adored. She had James's dark hair and her mother's eyes, and the particular kind of beauty that comes from a person who is extremely pleased to exist and shows it. James Crawford watched his 3 children one Sunday afternoon in the spring of 1885, William 6 and Thomas 4 and Clara 3, running through the bluebonnets in the east pasture, while Edna sat on the blanket beside him and her father read in the shade of the live oak 20 feet away. And he thought about his father's journal, the Christmas of 1851, and what his father had written about love applied to land over enough years. He thought his father had been right. But he thought the full truth of it was that the land was not just the acres and the cattle and the fence. The land was all of it. It was William's laugh and Thomas's careful eyes and Clara's imperious delight. It was Edna's straight-back competence, and the way she still held a book with both hands and the way she laughed when something genuinely surprised her. It was the kitchen that smelled of coffee and bread, and the porch where they sat in the evenings, and the spare room where Samuel Garner slept 4 times a year. It was all of it, the whole accumulated life of it, held together by love applied over enough years, and it was, in every particular that mattered, everything. "What are you thinking?" Edna asked, the way she sometimes did when he had been quiet for a while. He looked at her, this woman who had knocked on his door in a thunderstorm with a baby and a name she had taken back because she was not willing to be less than herself, not for a man who had not earned it, and he thought about how the act of claiming could go both ways, how he had claimed her and William, yes, but how she had also claimed him, claimed the life and the ranch and the future with the same full and unconditional intention. "I am thinking about a journal," he said. She looked puzzled. "Your father's?" "No," he said, "my own. I think I should start keeping one." She considered this. "What would you write?" "This," he said, "all of it. So that someday Thomas or William or Clara can find it and read it and know who their parents were when they were young, and that their father looked at their mother on a Sunday afternoon in the bluebonnets and thought she was the best thing that had ever happened to him, and that he put it down in ink so it would not be lost." Edna Garner Crawford looked at her husband for a long moment, and then she said, "Then write it tonight. Start from the beginning. Write about the thunderstorm and the door." "I will," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and across the pasture their children ran through the Texas spring flowers with the abandon of people who have never had reason to doubt that the world is, at bottom, a good place to be, which was the most important thing 2 people could ever give anyone, and which James and Edna Crawford had given them with the wholeness of everything they had survived and chosen and built together. The afternoon went gold and long across the hills, and the creek sounded over its limestone bed below the pasture, and the cattle in the north field moved in their slow and peaceful way, and the Crawford ranch held all of it, the way good land holds everything you give it, without loss and without end. That evening, after the children were in bed and Samuel Garner was reading in the lamplight of the spare room, and the house was quiet with the good quiet of a full life resting, James Crawford sat down at his father's desk and opened a new ledger book to the first page and picked up his pen. He wrote at the top of the first page the date, May 3rd, 1885, Kerr County, Texas. And then he wrote, "She knocked on my door at midnight in a thunderstorm, and she had a baby against her chest and her own name reclaimed, and I have never once in all the years since been anything but grateful that I opened it." He paused and looked at the words, and then looked up at the doorway where, without his having heard her, Edna had appeared in her nightgown with her hair down, carrying 2 cups of coffee in the way she sometimes did in the evenings when she knew he was still at the desk. She set 1 cup beside him and looked at what he had written, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she smiled, the full smile, the one that had been building since a thunderstorm in 1878 and had never stopped. "That is a good beginning," she said. "It is," he said. "I have good material." She kissed the top of his head the way she did when he was at the desk and she was passing through, and she went back toward their bedroom, and he heard her pause in the doorway and say, without turning around, "Come to bed soon." "I will," he said. "I just have one more thing to write." He looked back at the page and he wrote, "And I intend to keep writing this down every day for as long as God gives me days, because this is the best story I know, and it deserves to be told right." He closed the journal and picked up the coffee cup and sat for a moment in the lamplight of the room his father had built, in the life his wife had walked into and made her own, and he listened to the creak and the night wind in the cedar, and the silence of sleeping children, and he felt, with a completeness that had no gap in it anywhere, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He blew out the lamp and went to join his wife.